for more background, I started out at Harvard. I went to Harvard College, graduated in '85 from Quincy House, if there are any Quincy people here. I went and did graduate work for 5 years at Stanford University in population genetics, and thoroughly expected that I was going to be an academic and work in a lab for the rest of my life. And what I found was I was just very dissatisfied with the questions that we could answer. We could ask great questions, but our ability to get to the answers was very, very frustrating and felt limiting, felt rather isolated with that. It was very easy to be the world's expert in something incredibly narrow because no one else was looking at it. And so then I decided to just make a big change of course. And I came back to Harvard, went to Harvard Law School, graduated in '93. And again, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. I was casting about. I was in a joint degree program with the Kennedy School of Government, thinking maybe I could apply my science learning to, FDA issues or maybe Centers for Disease Control, because I did a lot of modeling of genetic systems, or maybe work for like Senate staff, something like that, on a committee that was involved with, environmental release of genetically modified organisms. That sounded kind of interesting to me, and a little scary. And then as just a lark, a third-year law student, when I was a first-year law student, found out there was a biologist in the first-year class, and she asked me to lunch and told me what she was doing. And she was working at a patent firm in Boston and doing intellectual property, which were two words which I had never before put together in my life. I had heard of patents, but I didn't really know much at all about them. So I went on an interview and found that everyone I interviewed with was a former scientist who had gone to law school and went into patent law. And I thought, what the heck, this sounds good. I'll try it for a summer. I loved it. It was really fascinating work. It allowed me to apply the science learning to sort of a business context. There's a government context to it. There's the court context to it. And do something that was very concrete and applicable. As opposed to what I was doing, which was theoretical population genetics. And here I was like working with people who are actually building companies and making stuff and trying to cure diseases and get the money necessary, the financing to build those companies and to navigate the legal complexities. And I've been doing it ever since. I'm now a partner at Wilmer, Cutler, Pickering, Hale & Dorr, which we mercifully abbreviate as Wilmer Hale. And I'm in the IP department there. And about half my time is working with companies and inventors on developing new IP, developing new patent applications, and fighting with the patent office to get those. Another good chunk of my time is spent working with investors who are trying to figure out whether or not they should invest in companies, whether or not the companies have appropriately protected their IP position and it's a safe investment. Some portion of my time is split up with licensing arrangements and rarely litigation when that's necessary. So if I can now get a sense of who you are, so how many people here are like mostly interested in medical devices, anything from a bone screw to an artificial heart? Okay, that's a good number. And then what about something like small molecule drugs? Okay, we've got some chemists here. What about large molecules, biologics? Okay, all right. What about things like discovery platforms, research tools for identifying, targets to screen for new inhibitors or activators of things? Okay. And then what about manufacturing platforms like protein expression systems or cell-based systems? Okay, a couple of that on that. What about bioinformatics? Okay, all right. All right, so we've got a smattering here. For those of you who might be interested in the recent Supreme Court opinions, the ACLU versus Myriad and Mayo versus Prometheus, I think those questions are going to be less interesting to most of the people in the room. So can we just save those for the end? And during the question period, I can take those, or I'd be happy. I could talk for hours about those two opinions. They're dreadful opinions, but I don't think it's of general interest. So I'd ask you to try and hold off on that. So health science or life science companies are really just very, very different than the tech startups. And when I started out in the field, the VCs were jumping into biotech the way they had jumped into high tech. And high tech's easy. You know, you hire, 20 recent graduates from the institution downstream. You lease about 1,000 square feet of space. You get some used furniture from Peabody Office Furniture. You get some, computers. You network them together, and you give them 6 months to come up with a product. And if they don't, you pull the plug, and you fire everybody. You return the furniture. You don't renew the lease. I mean, the risk was pretty low. And if you had 10 people all working on one piece of software, they might actually do something in 6 months. And the VCs jumped into biotech that way, and they'd say, here's $3 million, go develop a drug. And they were shocked to find out that it didn't work that way. And there was sort of a first boom in biotech funding, and then this big crash as the VCs got totally disenchanted with it. And now we've in sort of a more realistic phase where people recognize these very big differences, that life science companies, health companies require much, much bigger capital investments. Laboratories are much more expensive spaces than the garage where you can write software. Development times, much, much longer. Starting with your cell-based assays perhaps and going all the way up through animal studies, and if you are lucky enough, getting into clinical trials with something. Or even if it's genetically modified corn that you're working on, there's lots of generation time. There are things that are very slow in the process. A lot more uncertainty in the R&D. A capacitor is a capacitor and will always behave as a capacitor. But when you, let's say, transfer a protein from one species into another, God only knows what it's going to interact with. And you've got a lot more uncertainty as you move from a cell-based assay to a whole animal-based assay. What works in the cell may not work in the whole organism or may be toxic to the organism. So all the way up until the end, drugs going into phase 3 clinical trials, the majority are still failing after years and years and years. So you've got uncertainty right up to the end. Commercialization costs are a lot higher also. It's very cheap once you've got your software to burn a whole bunch of CDs and put them in plastic boxes and ship them out. The manufacturing for most biotech drugs, biologics, small molecules, whatever it might be, much, much higher, or even medical devices. And medical devices, you've got the same issue until you start actually implanting them into people. It looks good on the model or on the cadaver, but when you try it in situ in a person, you don't really know how well they'll work. Regulatory burdens are enormous for all of the health sciences, diagnostics as well as pharmaceuticals. So the FDA will be scrutinizing everything. That's not a problem in high tech. If you buy your cell phone from Radio Shack and it turns out to be a piece of junk, well, too bad, you wasted your money. The government's not going to come in. But you're not going to be able to sell a junky drug. Now, on the good side, you've got much longer product lifetimes. And this is hopeful because you might actually get back some of your investment for all of this work that you're doing. If you do find a drug that gets FDA approval, or you've got a good medical device, an insulin delivery system that works very well, gives you good controlled levels. That could be on the market for 10 or 15 years easily before it gets replaced. In the high-tech world, things are obsolete in a couple of years, which actually makes patent protection questionable in those areas because the time it takes to get a patent is so long that the product might be obsolete before it issues. And then also the health science startups have different exit strategies generally. A lot of the high-tech companies think they're going to do an IPO, and they can do it because if you're burning CDs or you're making gadgets that you can outsource to India or China, you can get that done and you can sell those parts or you can sell the software. That's easy. It's much more common to see M&A as an exit strategy in health sciences. You want to be acquired by big pharma or some other big company. That's your way to cash out. You don't want to develop the sales force, and you don't want to be doing clinical trials if you started as a bench science company. And I don't have it down here, but the most common exit strategy Anyone have a guess for that? Health sciences is bankruptcy. So get used to it if you want to be an entrepreneur. Let's see. So in your strategy, just some basic questions to keep in mind when you're starting out. Know what you actually have in terms of intellectual property. And I want to emphasize not what you hope to have in the future. You've got a plan, that's fine, but you don't get patents on plans. You're supposed to get patents on inventions which have been conceived and at least constructively reduced to practice, which is a buzz term meaning you've got it formed in such a fixed concrete idea and know so well how you're going to do it that you can write it down and someone of ordinary skill in your art, whatever your area of expertise is, could read it and do it with a reasonable expectation of success. That's how well developed it has to be in order for you to get a patent. So it's not, you know, we're going to do X, then we're going to do Y, then we're going to do Z. If you haven't done them, you're not going to get a patent on it yet. Know what you need for your company. So know what you have, know what you need. Do you need rights that other people have? It may turn out that you set up shop and then you realize that there's someone who has a patent that controls some essential element of what you're trying to develop, and it's going to shut down your R&D program as soon as it starts. Or, worse yet, they'll wait until you get fairly far along, and then when you've got something useful, then they can sue you, and basically you'll have no one to sell it to but them because they've got this controlling IP. You're over a barrel. Yes?
How about if you can't figure out what you need because you're doing something in software and what you incorporate is so obvious to you that it's like the one-click market basket checkout or the finger swipe across the screen? How do you research and investigate all the patents of the obvious?
Yeah, it's a thicket. So there's this huge dichotomy between sort of life science, I'll throw chemistry, biology, medical all together, and computer engineering from software to mechanical engineering together. On the life sciences side, you've got this huge literature. You've got all these academic centers who are actually doing a lot of the work. They publish to get their work done. And the government does a lot of research and they publish. And you can search and you can find all sorts of information. And a molecule is a molecule. You can search on the chemical structure, and the chemical structures will be contained in patents, and you'll be able to find it. And there are search services that are expert at doing that, and that's easy. You're absolutely right. In the hardware and software areas, no one publishes. Certainly no one puts their code out there, it makes it very difficult to find the prior art. It's one of the reasons why the people on the software side are constantly complaining about a lot of junky patents issuing in software. And there was a lot of pressure on the courts and on Congress to do something about it. The courts came out with a decision, KSR, where they basically sort of relaxed the requirement for patent examiners to find certain aspects of the prior art in printed publications, and said, you can use common sense, and you can say, this, the examiner can simply step in and say, I think this is obvious. And I don't see that in the art, but I see this in the art, and I see this in the art, and this in the art, and I could put those together, and you could do that. And the court said that the person of ordinary skill in the art is not an automaton. They have some general, innovative sense, and they can take logical steps to progress things. So you can't search it, and you're at risk. And it's very difficult. What you want to hope for is that whatever it is that you're using, you've got different modules that in the event something pops up, that you can design around the patent, and that's a term of art that we use. So the patent claims this, you just go around it by doing something different. And if you've got those options, you're in a much better position.
Always modular.
Yeah, if you can. So determine what you can afford. It's a big issue. IP protection is expensive. You can't take every idea that you have and file a patent application on it in every jurisdiction in the world. I'll show you some numbers on cost in a little bit. And there are a lot of companies that wind up being, they call them patent poor. The company has no money, but it's got patents. and they can't afford to do research, but they've got all these applications pending. And now they're trying to basically sell a patent portfolio to the VCs or to some company, some potential acquirer, but they don't have the budget to actually do the experiments to get to their proof of concept. And so we'll talk a bit about that and how to avoid it. And so decide what to protect based on what you can afford, what you need, and what you know you have, and decide what to avoid in terms of the patents owned by third parties that you're aware of. And you've got to think about that early on, because you don't want to start down a path where you're doing your product development in terms of what seems most efficient to you, only to find out that there's a block. Better to find out earlier that you need to avoid some third-party patent and go around it even if it is less efficient. And as academics, you know, there's a tendency to just want to do the most graceful, elegant solution to the problem. Sometimes you don't, because of these landmines that are in the patent landscape. Choosing the right type of IP protection. I'll just talk about two. I'm not going to talk about trademarks and copyrights here tonight. Let's just talk about trade secret and patents. These are your two big options for inventions. You can simply try to keep everything secret. And it's not enforceable. There's no enforcement mechanism. If someone gets your trade secret, however they might get it, right? They get your trade secret, it's no longer a secret, and that's the end of it. The trade secret is dead. It could be a former employee who goes blab, someone leaves a notebook in the subway, whatever it might be. Someone else independently develops it. You can't now come back and say, well, I developed it first. It was my trade secret. It's not enforceable in any sense. The only thing you can possibly do is sue a person who wrongfully disclosed the trade secret, which would generally be an employee who goes out and breaches their duty of confidentiality to the company. Maybe they get hired away by another company, but it's not very satisfying. Odds are they don't have a lot of money. Odds are you take every penny that they have, it's not going to help your company very much because you've lost your trade secret. Yes, Alice?
I was just curious, are there certain types of IP that lends itself more to trade secrets than others? Like, I was told once that, like, manufacturing practices, maybe, like, when it's something physical, it's easier to do that with than something conceptual.
Things that are not sold. So just about anything that goes on the shelf can be reverse engineered, right? So if your trade secret, though, is your method of manufacturing so that you're getting, let's say you're making discs, chips, circuit chips. And they're made on these silicon wafers, and they do 100 different, or 100 or 500 chips on one disk. But there's a defect rate, and those defects are a pain. They cut the chips out, they test them, and they wind up discarding a fairly high percentage of them and only keeping the ones that work. If you can knock down, if you've got something in your process that reduces that error rate, you can decrease your manufacturing costs very significantly and have a big edge in the market. If you were doing cell culture type stuff. There's lots of secret sauce in growing cells. Things that just seem like magic and people can't even reproduce them in other laboratories. And so don't put it in your patent application unless you have to, because you may give away the secret sauce and you'll never know if someone else is using it. Yes?
Can you run into problems if you use a trade secret and obviously you don't publish anything and someone else, what you said, they come up with it at the same time and they happen to patent it, that you're not only competing against them, but you're prevented from actually doing it?
Yeah, so the question is, if you're maintaining something as a trade secret, someone else comes up with it independently and they patent it, are you out of luck? And the answer is, yeah, you're screwed. So you made your choice. You weren't going to seek patent protection. You weren't going to disclose it. So a patent is a bargain with the public, all right? So the theory behind it is this. You have to file an application which discloses your invention and which teaches someone of ordinary skill in the art how to make and use your invention without undue experimentation and with a reasonable expectation of success. These are all the buzzwords you'll hear if you get involved with this. So you've got to make that divulgation of information. And in exchange, you get your patent and you have the right to use it for 20 years from your date of filing, okay? That's the quid pro quo. You got your exclusivity. The government will give you a monopoly but you've got to disclose it so that when your monopoly is over, now it's thoroughly in the public domain. And if you decide to go the trade secret route, you're not divulging it, you're not giving it to the public, and you're at risk of someone independently developing it and patenting it, and you have no recourse. All right? So as I said, all you can do is you basically sue someone who breaches a confidentiality agreement with you. It's hard, and you're not going to get the secret back. All you can do is get money damages from that person. Yeah?
So, so even if somebody doesn't, you can't recover from one of your employees, for example, but the recipient of the confidential information would probably be another company. So what is the burden of proof that you have to show to the courts that the recipient knowingly or unknowingly was a participant in this fraud?
Yes, I mean, it would be exactly that. You would have to show that they were knowingly interfering with your contractual relations with their former employee. It would be tortious interference with contract. You could try to get damages there. But, the employers will all have, when you get a new employee, they're going to have to sign an agreement with the company. And that agreement is going to say, I will not give to the company, my new company, any trade secrets of my former company. And they make you swear that you're never going to do that. So if it does happen, they hide behind that and they say, we had no idea. We received it innocently. And if they received it innocently, secret's gone. You can't get it back. So but if they purposefully, got your employee and lured them away from your company and then pressured them to give them the secrets, you could go for a tortious interference claim against them. I think that's about it. So it's not going to be easy. It's like Slugsworth in Willy Wonka trying to get the kids to divulge the gobstopper. Okay, why would you want to do a trade secret? Well, sometimes there are things, these secrets that aren't patentable. It might be something that's a law of nature, a phenomenon of nature. It might be an algorithm which isn't per se patentable. Or it could be something where just enforcement is so impractical that you've got your patent describing it, but how in the world would you know if anyone's enforcing it? Or if it's the kind of thing that can be moved around the world so easily, all a competitor has to do is find a place to practice your invention where you don't have a patent. I'll give you a real example, and I advised a company to do this. There was a company that had a patent on a method of producing an antibody to whatever it was, protein X, comprising administering immunogenic preparation of a certain epitope, right? That's what their patent covered. They didn't have a patent on the antibodies. It was the method of generating antibody through immunization. So you had to do the immunization method. So we just told them, ship the rabbits to Australia. They don't have a patent in Australia. Shoot them up with the immunogen in Australia. When they've got a good reaction, ship the frozen spleens back here. You're not infringing. Okay, so it's easy. I mean, depending upon what what you're doing and what you're claiming, it's pretty easy to get around certain types of inventions. So a trade secret might just be your best way. Why publish the chemical structure of your immunogen, give away the epitope to everyone in the world so that they can use it any place where you don't have a patent? So getting a patent isn't necessarily a good idea because it forces you to divulge what would otherwise be a trade secret. And wait for Alice.
So if you're working on a medical device and there are a few algorithms within software that make your medical device work, and you want to get a patent on it, do you have to reveal those algorithms because that's the only way someone could reproduce your medical device?
If it is reflected in the claimed invention. So what you need to do in a patent specification, so the specification is the body of the patent, it's the part that looks like a scientific paper, okay? Scientific paper with really awkward legalese language. In there, you have to provide a written description of the invention and the best method known to you of making and using it, which would enable the person of ordinary skill in the art to make and use without undue experimentation with a reasonable expectation of success. Okay? So The patent office will look at that, and if you're claiming some aspect and that can't be achieved without disclosing the algorithm, then the claim shouldn't issue. So now if it's not necessary, if there's something else that's patentable that you've done, then fine. But if it's necessary to make and use the invention, yeah, it's got to be in the patent application. So you can't hold those things back. There are, I'll give you another example though, like a time when I had a client pull back from something. It was a big biotech company that has a very large facility not far from here. And they had come up with a vector which was really good for expressing proteins in a certain type of cell, and they wanted to get a patent on the vector. And then typically you'll do claims to the vector with a heterologous gene in there, to a cell transformed with the vector and the heterologous gene, to a method of producing the protein encoded by the heterologous gene, blah, blah, blah. All the different ways you can look at the invention. The method of producing the protein would have been in a certain cell type. So their best mode, the best way they knew how to do it, was in a certain cell type. They didn't want to disclose the cell type because they had found in bioreactors you've got problems with cells that mutate and they wind up sticking to the walls of the vat and they build up and they clog everything up, and you'd like the cells to remain in solution. And they actually finally got a cell line that didn't, they had no idea what mutation it had, but it actually grew really well in the reactor. They didn't want to disclose it. So we pulled back the claims on methods of producing the protein because that would have implicated doing it in the cells. We'd have to disclose the cells. And we relied just on claims to the vector and stopped there. So you can define your invention sometimes in order to maintain some trade secrets. And sometimes it'll work. It just depends a lot on your invention. The other time when trade secrets are really useful is when the value is really ephemeral. Another example, life sciences. Someone discovers the leptin receptor, and they publish on it and they file a patent application on the leptin receptor, and they have claims to methods of identifying inhibitors so that you could have this wonderful weight loss drug. But a patent typically takes, biotech, 5, 7, 8 years often before it issues. And it's published 18 months after you file it. Plus, they published it in the scientific literature as well, so it was out there, right? The patent was pointless because everyone, all the big drug companies were going through their small molecule libraries, screening them against the receptor, and they were going to be done in way less than 5 or 7 or 8 years. By the time the patent had issued, everyone had done as much research as they could or wanted to on it, and you'd have a patent to stop people from doing something they already did, and that's too late. It's too late to do that. So there's a place for trade secrets. Okay, patents. Now, what do patents do that's quite different? A patent actually confers the right to exclude others from practicing, more jargon, practicing the invention, making, using, selling, offering for sale, or importing is practicing the invention, right? So you can exclude others. If someone else is doing what you have claimed and you've got an issued patent claim to, you can go to court, you have a trial, and if you win, they find that they are doing what you have claimed and you have a patent to, an order will issue telling them to stop doing it. You can get monetary damages if you suffered any damages for them doing it. Or you could license it to them for royalty, let them keep doing it, but you're going to make some money off the top. What a patent doesn't do, and this is rather counterintuitive, is it doesn't give you the right to practice your own invention. So I have a patent on a method of doing X with steps A, B, and C, and that doesn't mean that you can do X with steps A, B, and C, because someone might have patented already a method of doing X, including step A, and you infringe that because you do step A. You also do steps B and C, but that doesn't matter. Their step A patent covers what you're doing, right? Or it's a cell culture medium and you found this gamish of compounds that makes your embryonic stem cells thrive. And you want to do that, but it turns out that one of the compounds that you're putting in there is patented. Someone's got a patent on one of the growth factors. The fact that you have a patent on your overall cell culture medium does you no good. You need a license under their patent for that component of the overall thing. So doesn't give you a freedom to operate, doesn't mean that you're free to do what you've patented. It means you can exclude others from doing it, okay? Yes.
I just had a quick question about the applications.
Mm-hmm.
Patent application has no enforcement power.
No. Nope. There's some provisional royalty rights if you provide a third party with notice of your claims and your claims issue substantially identical to what was published, you may be able to sue them for damages for a reasonable royalty on the intervening period. I don't think I've ever seen it happen. It's just, because I haven't seen the case law yet as to what substantially identical means. It's one of those words like reasonable doubt that, it takes years and years and years of cases for people to get a sense of what it means. And it's fairly new doctrine. So why file patent applications, okay? And I'm a patent attorney, and this is my business, and I wish you would all file lots of patent applications through my firm. But I gotta say, why? So there are substantial disadvantages, okay? Your publication of your patent application at 18 months is going to disclose your trade secrets. There's no guarantee you'll ever get the patent. So it's guaranteed your trade secrets are going to be published, but there's no guarantee a patent will ever issue. And even if a patent does issue, years down the road, all right? So it could be, again, 5 to 10 years away that your trade secrets have been out there. Are you better off just keeping it secret and getting to market first? And being to market first is a big, big advantage. More disadvantages, cost. So these are guesstimates, depends on what the invention is. But maybe $15,000 to $40,000 to draft and file your initial application. And that's if you want it to be real complete. You can do these, we'll talk about provisionals a little bit later. People do these quick and dirty provisionals that are real cheap. I'm not a fan. But if you want to do a real good job on a complicated thing, there's your initial cost. Then, 12 months later, you're probably going to want protection outside the United States. So you'll file a PCT, that's the Patent Cooperation Treaty, a PCT application. That will basically give you access to protection all around the world. Almost all the major industrialized nations are members of the PCT, and increasingly even Turks and Caicos joined. I mean, so it's almost the planet at this point. Then at the 30-month date, so 30 months from filing your first case. So you file, 12 months later, you do a PCT. At the 30-month date, some countries 31 first month date, you have to nationalize your PCT application in the countries where you really want protection. Costs skyrocket, okay? The 25 grand assumes you're going real cheap. You're going to take like English-speaking countries like the US, Canada, and Australia. They don't have to do translations. You're certainly going to want Europe, though. Probably going to pay $6,000, $7,000 there. If you want Japan, depends on how long it is. There's page limits and your translation fees, and then it gets weird. For some reason, a translation into Finnish is 10 times the cost of a translation into Swedish. So you'll find you can easily spend $250,000 trying to cover the big country, whatever countries are relevant for you, and the big countries certainly, and that number can go way, way higher. I have a client that's tried to hit every place on the planet that they could find, and they spent well over $1.5 million nationalizing an application. So that cost hits, and then in each of those countries, the patent offices pick up the application and they start examining it, and you now have to pay lawyers in each of those countries to fight with each of those patent offices, all right? So let's say you have a US attorney who drafted the case and is in charge of it. I would correspond with those people and I would give them instructions, but every one of them is going to be sending a bill every time they have to do something. So, $5,000 annual costs, really low end. That's assuming you're just doing like the US, right? 50 grand if you were doing the major countries, and it could get much higher if you did every place, yeah.
Thank you. Does PCT give you any kind of protection for software or algorithms in China, practically speaking?
So first response is PCT gives you no protection at all. A patent does not issue from a PCT application. It is sort of a pre-application, it's a holding place application before you nationalize into the different countries. There will be an examination of the PCT application by PCT examiners. We have them in the US, they're in Munich, they're in The Hague, they're in various receiving offices and Korea has a very good examining office for software. And can you nationalize software into China? As far as I know, yes. But a lot of us in the field, China has a wonderful constitution. On paper, it looks better than ours, but I wouldn't trust my civil rights over there so much. Their patent laws are wonderful too. If you read their patent laws, you would think there's no piracy whatsoever of American IP coming out of China. But so it's the enforcement that's the issue. And again, how do you know? How do you know if someone's infringing your patent in Guangdong? I mean, you have no idea what's happening unless you see products being shipped into the U.S. and you can stop them, as they're arriving at port in San Diego. I mean, you might be able to do that, but generally, you're going to be ignorant about what's going on, and then that's the first step to enforcement is identifying the infringement. So that's tough. And of course, it's time consulting for the R&D people and the principals of the company to be dealing with IP issues all the time, and the lawyer is always calling and dragging the people away from the bench so that they can work on responses to patent offices. So that's a cost. Else, we have a question in the back.
Mike, sorry.
Hi, thanks. I think so, yeah. So the lowest cost that you have listed there, annual cost for prosecuting U.S. applications, I was curious what that implies, because I've heard that typical costs for enforcing a patent can be really, really expensive, like in the millions.
Yep, this is not enforcement. This is prosecution.
Okay,
So
could you nuance the difference there?
Yeah, so
Explain it to-
prosecution is the process of arguing with a patent office and trying to convince the patent office that what you've done is entitled to a patent. In the United States, the requirements are that the claimed invention be new or novel, hasn't been done before, useful, some sort of industrial applicability, that it be non-obvious. That's the tricky one in health sciences. So a person of ordinary skill in the art would not have found it obvious in light of all of the prior art. And the person of ordinary skill in the art is not very ordinary. They are presumed to know everything. They are presumed to know everything that was ever published anywhere in any language. Okay, so that's all prior art, and the person of ordinary skill has access to all of that, so they're presumed to know it. And then you've got your written description requirement of the application as well, that the application has to describe the invention, as I've said 10 times now, in order to allow one of skill in the art to make and use, blah, blah, blah. So that's the cost of arguing there. The $5,000 would be if you had a new small molecule, you write down the chemical structure, that's all you're claiming, and they can't find it anywhere in a database, they give you a patent, and it's real quick. If you want to claim a class of molecules with a bunch of R groups and variations and stuff, it could be a lot more expensive because they're going to be searching a lot more. Your claims might start to encompass the prior art. So you're claiming something that's already out there and it's been done already. Then you get into a process of amending your claims, narrowing them to avoid the prior art, and to figure out what truly is new that you've done. So the $5,000 is if you do a really narrow claim to something that's really, truly novel. Here's the enforcement costs, okay? So this is patent litigation. And it's extremely high. So these numbers are from the American Intellectual Property Law Association's 2013 economic report. They did surveys of patent firms across the country, and these are median numbers. So with less than $1 million at risk, it can cost you, the median is $700,000 to enforce the patent, which isn't a very good return, okay? Now, what often happens is when the at-risk number is the damages that you're asking for. So someone might have infringed your patent, sold 100,000 units of something, you're claiming less than $1 million damage on that. But if you win, you get an injunction, a court order that tells them they have to stop doing it. So then you've got the next 19 years of your patent without any infringement. So what's at risk there is a little bit, understated, because the value of an injunction can be really, really high because it gives you that monopoly. It clears the competitors out of your path. But as you can see, $5.5 million median for costs for $25 million at risk. A startup company can't afford to do that. Now, it's fine if you already sold yourself, there's been an M&A and you've been acquired by Genentech or Baxter or whatever, and they'll do it. And maybe when someone's infringing your patent, you go to them and that's part of your sales pitch for selling the company, that you've got a damages case against your arch competitor here by us. And then we've got the things we've talked about before where infringement could be undetectable because it's secret. Or it's just outside your geographic range. It's in some country where you don't have a patent. All right, so more disadvantages. Somewhere there's got to be a reason to get patents. Okay, good. All right, so why? Why do you want them? Because it's really the only way you can protect a product from direct copying. You can exclude others from the market. You have your monopoly rights that'll last for 20 years. That's your opportunity to earn back your R&D. The Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, now their estimates of the average cost of getting a drug through phase 3 trials and approved is now up to $1 billion. So $1 billion in R&D. Now that's actually not the cost of any one drug. What they're including in there is the 99 out of 100 that fail early on, and all the money that was wasted on the failures. They have to recoup that. But your patent period is where you're going to recoup that investment. So it allows you to exclude people. You can also, you patent, your invention may be able to be practiced in, 20 different ways. There's some variation about the theme, and you're going to commercialize what you see as the absolute best way of doing it. But you may get a scope of patent claim that's broader than that. You may get to cover sort of the general idea of what you've done, and that can actually give you a broader avenue and really keep people at bay and give you a much broader niche. So it's not just a matter of stopping someone from selling exactly your product. You may be able to carve out a space in the market. And we'll talk about sort of choke point claims in a bit. Licensing potential. So patents can be a great revenue source. You may come up with something that is useful in one context and you intend to apply it in that one context, but it has utility in a bunch of others. So perhaps the person who came up with Velcro intended to use it, on sneakers, and then it turns out like, oh, well, there's the backpack market and there's, the ski bags and then all these other different things that you can use it for. You're only going to manufacture and sell the one product, but you can license those rights to other people to use it in other contexts. Or you develop an antibody that you intend to use as a diagnostic, but you license the rights to it to another party that's going to develop it for therapeutic purposes. And as a startup, you'd be wise to probably start with diagnostics and not go to therapeutics first. So there's a real use of them. You can't really license a trade secret very easily. So the patents for a startup company are often one of the key things that the investors are banking on. They know that even if the company goes under, well, at least there's some kind of asset that they could sell at some point in a bankruptcy sale. If the key personnel leave, it's nice to know that there's IP that's going to stay. So it's all well and good that you're investing in part in the founders and they're geniuses and they've got this great vision and you're going to sell the VCs on the founders' vision. But they'd also like to see the IP. So your IP becomes a real marketing tool and a money-raising tool to convince people that there's something here that's going to stay, there's something worth investing in. It also gets you past sort of the sniff test that the patent office looked at this and the patent office thought it was good enough, new enough, non-obvious for a patent. That's something, right? So it gives them a little bit more security that they're not just being romanced by the startup into investing in something that's a pipe dream or that may not work or is very obvious. litigation isn't always necessary. So having your patents can be a real deterrent. And rule number one for a startup should be don't get sued. Because those numbers that I put up for the litigation costs, that's not just being the plaintiff, that's being the defendant. And if you're the defendant and you get sued, they could just put you out of business, all right? Even if you don't infringe, all right? So I have a client that was a startup of about 15 people. They had about, at their best, $2 million a year in revenue. They got sued by a $150 million market capitalization French firm, and their intent was to drive them out of business with the litigation. It was complete BS. They didn't infringe the claims, and we thought they were invalid to boot. But they just really didn't have the money to fight the litigation. Now, they wound up fighting it, and we basically fronted them the money to do so, and they won, and we invalidated the claims and all that, but it just put this huge cloud over the company, and it's cost them dearly. But if you've got your own patents, there's a real deterrent effect. People will try to avoid that litigation scenario. They will design around you. They'll stay out of your market space and leave you alone to avoid it. Even pending applications. If you've got a risk-averse competitor, you don't even have the patent yet, but you file an application claiming that I think I own this. Do they want to now put $50 million into a research program to develop something which you may have a patent on in 3 or 5 years? It really increases their downside risk. And that can be bargaining chips too. So if you've got a good patent estate, your competitor's got a good patent estate, you could both do mutually assured destruction by suing each other. But odds are instead you'll reach some sort of compromise. If you don't have any patents and they do, it's assured that you'll be destroyed instead. So it's a good defense to have. And sometimes companies will purposefully patent things they don't intend to use. You have your R&D people looking at the competitors' products and patents and saying, God, they're stupid, why don't they do this? They could improve their product by changing this way. Well, you can file a patent application on that and cover that and prevent them from improving their product. And you can really, or use it as a bargaining chip again. Okay, so what should you do to implement an IP strategy at your startup? One is learn a little patent law. I know the saying, a little learning is a dangerous thing. It's okay. If you're going to be an entrepreneur, you should be ready for a little danger. So try and get conversant with it. Get conversant with the concepts and the subjects. Everyone at the company has got to understand it at some level. Certainly, a bunch of the management people, the R&D heads, and you've got to sort of inculcate this knowledge throughout the company. You really want to be on the alert for finding inventions when they're made. You want to be on the alert for blowing rights through disclosures. Being helpful to the patent attorney, because if we're not in your lab, we don't know what you're doing, we don't see all the prototypes, we don't know the things that you tried that failed necessarily. You've got to be able to spot the things that are key that will help us draft the applications well to cover what's important and to really help explain to us what's going to be important here. And just knowing a little patent law will help you know when to talk to the attorney. And really, if you ask a patent attorney to give a free tutorial to your whole company, they'll show up. It's actually to our advantage. We would much rather be working with a company of people who know what they're doing than deal with trying to clean up mistakes afterwards. It's very frustrating. So I think 90 out of 100 attorneys in Boston would be happy to come to your company and give a tutorial. Know the prior, yes?
In terms of that, do you think there's any advantage to, along with that, do you think there's any advantage to taking the patent bar if you have the time and money to take the class? Or even if you don't plan on ever becoming a patent attorney yourself, just to have that knowledge?
Boy, I wouldn't. It's a drag, and it's a lot of just horrific detail. So it's rules, and you basically have to memorize 35 U.S. code and 37 CFR, and it's just all these regulations. You need conceptual stuff. here. And the patent bar is actually the only federally administered bar exam. And it's, I think right now, like they're giving out registration numbers to like in like the 70,000s. So there really just haven't been that many people doing it. So it's a small group. But I just wouldn't recommend that. It's just, know the prior art. Teach yourself how to do some of these things, how to find out about. So what's the prior art? The prior art is everything that has been published and is publicly available, is publicly known, publicly used prior to the date you file your application or your priority date. Everything. So a dissertation in Hungarian in a university library, one copy in Budapest. It's part of the prior art, all right? You're supposed to know it. So it is so much easier now that we've got databases, but 20 years ago it was really hellish. People would go down to the patent office and search paper copies of patents. There's lots of free stuff out there. The USPTO has a free database, which is awkward to use. It's really not great, but it's there and it's free. WIPO's Patent Scope, I think, is a little bit better. WIPO is the World Intellectual Property Organization. They run the PCT. EPO, the European Patent Office, has eSpaceNet and the Patent Register, which are actually quite good. For medical literature, health science literature, I'm sure you all know PubMed and databases like that. And there are commercial databases. If you've got the money to spend, I don't know if you will, but you can subscribe to things like Thomson Innovation has a great search engine. MicroPatent, I think, is that sort of a front end for Thomson's platform as well. And you can set up searches which will automatically run on a regular basis and update so that you could track competitors' patents and patent applications, or you can have keyword things where it'll just send you every now and then the latest stuff that's published, which is really kind of helpful.
How do you feel about using Google Patents for these searches?
I use it every day. It's convenient. It's the fastest thing on my, it's the fastest thing on my desktop to get to. I can log into these other ones and they keep timing me out. So it's just, I use it all the time. When I'm doing a real search though, for a client, I use the commercial databases because they can hit everything, so they'll hit the Japanese databases and the, Canadian database and Australian. So, Google Patents is a good, quick and dirty way of doing things. Frankly, anything that's important is going to get a PCT application filed. So even if you limited your searches to PCT applications, you're going to get 99% of stuff. But for our legal practice, 99% is not good enough, so we'll do the commercial databases. LexisNexis Total Patent, I think it's a total mess, but it's there. You can use it. I really don't like it at all. Okay, then teach your attorney. So some people go around thinking they interview patent attorneys and think, I'm trying to find someone who is an expert in FcRn antibodies and they're used in regulating, immune, complement-mediated immune reactions. You're not going to find that. All right, you're not going to find a patent attorney who knows exactly what you're doing. If they did know exactly what they're probably representing your competitor, and then they can't represent you anyway, right? And so you're going to have to teach your attorney. A good one you can treat like a first-year grad student, in your lab, and give them some review articles, bring them up to speed, spend some face time, much more efficient than sending people stacks of papers. I have some clients who invite me to their lab meetings, and I'm happy to go and not charge for the time. Again, in the end, it helps me because I know what's going on in the company, and after the lab meeting, I might walk up to someone and say, what were you talking about? I never heard about this project before. And then we find out that there's been some project going on that actually they've solved some problem and nobody thought to write up an invention disclosure. And so you become aware of things. So teach the attorney. We're educable. Let's see. So patent claims that cover, that the claim encompasses the prior art or the prior art falls inside the description of the claims are not allowable. So you really have to identify that. You got to know the prior art so you don't waste your time trying to claim things that you're not entitled to. That's very important. And it's important for obviousness reasons. It's important for what we'll call teach-aways. Again, it's a little term of art. If the prior art all says, you got to do it this way. And this is a real problem. You can't use this for this reason. And you find out that it's wrong, that you can. So that prior art, it doesn't anticipate your invention. It doesn't fall within the scope of your claims, but it's really relevant. That's great ammunition for us. We go to the patent office and we say, look, examiner, all the art was pointing this way. Our guys went that way. This is non-obvious. They're entitled to a patent. So you got to be aware of that. Looking at your competitors' patent applications is great for lots of reasons. One, avoid infringing their patents. You don't want to get in a lawsuit. But two, look at the kind of claims they're getting. Look at the kind of things that they're regarding as inventions. You will probably be surprised at how small they are. I remember doing something for a medical device company where it was basically sort of a spectrophotometer for looking at some blood samples, and it was feeding in a series of tubes that were in a rack. The invention was that the tubes were not circular in cross-section, they were squared so that the light didn't bend. And I was just like, damn, why didn't anyone think of that before? But no one had. and they were getting much better readings using these things. Plus, the beauty of it was they could then sell these square vials to the hospitals, which would then dispose of them. And the disposables were the actual big driver of revenue, not the machine that they sold in the first place. So you'll be surprised at the little things that are patentable. And what I'll often tell people is, tell me about what you did that didn't work. Because if you were working on something and you couldn't get it to work and couldn't get it to work and couldn't get it to work and finally figured out how to do it, that's probably an invention. I'm assuming that you're one of skill in the art, right? That you're not a dope. So if you didn't figure it out without doing a bunch of errors, that suggests to me it's non-obvious. And there's a lot of focus, too much focus by people on, I want to achieve this end goal here. But to get to that end goal, I've got to go through 25 steps. And if you've got 5 hurdles between the beginning and the end goal, you might have 5 patents there. And any one of them could be valuable. Any one of them could stop your competitor from getting to the same goal. So anything that really was a problem for you, you should tell your attorney about, because that's something for us to focus on. Let's see. Competitors' patents will often have a lot of information that's disclosed. You can learn their trade secrets because they're publishing all their trade secrets. They may not get the patent because the examiner doesn't think it's worthy, or because they decide not to spend any more money on it. So you can actually get a lot of free information from that. And stuff where they're not publishing. They may not be, they wouldn't publish this stuff in a scientific journal, but they're dumping it into their patent application. So start reading the patent literature. You can see where the competition is going. That'll tell you, oh, they're filing patents over here. That must mean the company is going to follow this path in their research. That's an opening for us. Let's go this way. All right, so you can try and avoid collisions with the competition. And I'd suggest, if you can, maintain an updated library of patents, and have them accessible to people in the company. Yeah.
So you had mentioned sometimes companies will file patents with no intention of ever using it.
Yeah.
So if they were to do that and you look at their patterns and assume that they're going in a certain direction, do people try to mislead their competition with patents? It seems like a really expensive way to use it.
It's not that they file patents in order to with no intention of using them. Is that they'll file a patent application and then they may wind up abandoning it because it doesn't pan out. So you're filing early on in the R&D process. You get to look good in vitro. You put it in a mouse. It looked lousy. They drop it. But there's still information in there that you could pick up. Maybe you can make it work where they couldn't make it work. There are things called defensive publications. IBM was sort of the leader in that. They actually created their own magazine called the IBM Technical Bulletin or something like that. And whenever they had invention disclosures, they couldn't possibly file patents on all the things their engineers were coming up with. They didn't want anyone else to get patents on them. So they published them in this self-published bulletin just to get them out there, create prior art so that no one else would get a patent on it. And you can do defensive publications, but patent application is a very expensive way of doing a defensive publication. Yes?
I've heard some advice from some people that to not search competitors' patents, unless you really have to, because that you might, be knowingly infringing later on, and that you'll be subject to, treble damages? Do you have what's your philosophy about that?
It's like not looking at the road signs so that you didn't know I was speeding, It's just, I'd rather know. I mean, and there is an issue. So you have a duty to disclose to the Patent Office. You have a duty to disclose all the material information that you are aware of. In fact, everybody involved in prosecution of the patent has that duty to disclose. So I have that duty on any case that I'm working on. So if you show me a piece of prior art and I think it's material, I have to send it to the Patent Office, whether you want me to or not. And if you are aware of something and do lots of searching, you'll become aware of more stuff. But to me, all that's going to do is, if that prior art is going to render the patent invalid, it's going to keep you from wasting your money pursuing an ultimately invalid patent. You can refocus elsewhere. You can design around, and come up with something better. Is an invalid patent of value? Yeah, it is. There'll be people who won't know that it's invalid, or they won't be sure that it's invalid, and they'll design around it. And so maybe you can keep your head in the sand and get your claims allowed. And even though they're ultimately invalid, if it ever went to court, it may not go to court because it has deterrent effect, and because juries have no idea what's going on with high-tech stuff. We had a trial last year on rationally designed meganucleases. They're proteins which cut DNA with recognition sites of 18 to 22 base pairs. That's huge. So they'll cut a genome in a single spot. And we did a focus group before the trial, a couple of weeks before the trial. We had a jury consultant come in. They got people from Delaware, and they arranged 3 jury pools, and we did a presentation, sort of a mock trial in front of them, and they were videotaped during their deliberations. And nobody had any idea what was going on. It was fascinating. And in each case, there was one person in the room who was louder than the others and basically bullied everybody else into going away with their opinion. And it was fascinating just watching the dynamics of these mock juries. And it was frightening. It was really, so trials are, very unpredictable things. And a lot of companies will avoid it. So you could have an invalid patent and you could win at trial. And so they do have value. If you've got the money to gamble on it, if you want to spend all the money on a lawsuit. So, okay, let's see. Next, okay. So patent strategies wind up being very, very specific to the situations. They can be company specific, really looking at your technology, what you want to do. Are you going to be a fee-for-service provider? Are people going to send you tissue samples from tumors, and you're going to look for particular oncogenes and do your bioinformatics analysis on it, and then send them back, some sort of report on the tissue? Is that your business? Or are you actually going to make something that's going to be sold in the Sigma catalog? You're going to come up with a new plasmid, and Life Technologies will sell it. So your strategy's got to think about how you're going to sell it, who are you going to market to, who will the infringers be, and how would you identify them? So you tailor your patent strategy that way. Stage of development matters to some extent too. I mean, obviously, for Merck, we do anything that is necessary to get a case if they're interested in it. For a startup, we got to figure out how much can we spend, what can we do, what's the budget, what has to be left on the floor. Industry specific, very different between the things that I have listed here. And then there's the choke point idea. So by choke points, I think I've sort of explained it now. One of my colleagues thinks, well, there's choke point approach, right? So I've got this long process to get to the product, or I've got a product that has 55 components, all right? And rather than trying to patent all of that, if I found out that what was really critical about my cell culture medium is that I've got a nicotinamide precursor at a concentration below a certain threshold, or in my engineering of a protein, I just find out that there's a certain residue which, if I change it, stabilizes the structure enormously, gives me much greater activity. Or in a medical device, insulin delivery pump, I discover a certain type of polymeric membrane which allows the flow to be better, right? Some sort of iontophoretic membrane. Maybe you just focus on that. You don't have to try and patent the entire device in all of its different aspects. If there's one major hurdle, if there's one aha moment, one problem, major problem that you had to solve, and it was the solution to that problem that is really what's letting you get to the product or the service, and everything else is relatively routine, focus on that choke point. Because if no one can do that, then they can't make something as good. The other approach is, if you don't know, there's the shotgun approach. And people go out there and they just file applications on every idea that comes into their head. And it's really expensive, but you'll wind up with, some coverage, and what turns out to be important, will hopefully be covered, but it's a lot more expensive to do that approach. So for startups, I very much recommend the choke point or bridges and tunnels. You can view it that way. You can't cover the entire landscape, but if you can cover the bridges and the tunnels that give access to it, then you've got good protection.
Hello. Hi. So I think it's a very interesting point that this kind of patent application actually is sometimes applied to the academy field as well. So my question is, what's the difference between the patent application, if from a academy field, for example, a university professor, something like that, and compared to a company-based patent application? And the second question is there also sometimes a collaboration between industry and academy, and the co-file applications in some sort of like that? And what's the difference, there? Thank you.
Yeah. So there's no reason that a patent application written by an academic or on behalf of an academic inventor should be written differently than one on behalf of a company. But there are residual effects of their different jobs. Academics tend to be looking more at proof of principle, trying to get at underlying mechanisms of action. We see lots of stuff coming out of the universities in the health sciences that are directed to that. It's basic research, and that's their interest. And the lab doesn't want to take it to market. So they stop way short of getting to something that's applicable. And so you'll see differences in the disclosures there. Companies are much more loath to publish. They don't want to give away any of their trade secrets if they can avoid it. So you will see sometimes more bare-boned applications coming out of companies. They're going to put in only what is necessary to enable the invention. And one of the problems I see, which is really just bad lawyering, is I do see a lot of patent attorneys will take a draft manuscript from an academic and they'll just turn it into a patent application, with a day or two of work, something like that. And it actually winds up being a very bad job, because in an academic paper, think about it, like you've got the introduction to your paper is talking about everything that came before, and you're trying to convince your readership, fellow scientists, that what you're doing follows in the footsteps of what's been done before. It's consistent and consonant with what's been done before. You should believe what I'm saying because it flows from what came before. And that is an explanation as to why it's obvious, right? So if a patent examiner looks at that, they're going to say, there you go. You've now explained why I should reject your application. So it's not a good approach to take an academic paper, put some claims on the back, and file it with the patent office. There are those differences. Collaborations between industry and academia are huge. There was a period where they weren't. Some of you may have heard of the Bayh-Dole Act. So prior to the Bayh-Dole Act, which was probably around 1980 or 84 or so, if the federal government gave any funding to support an invention, then anything that came out of that had to be freely licensable to anybody who wanted it, because it was taxpayers' money, and taxpayers' money went to support the invention, so you can't have any exclusive licenses. The result was that academic collaborations were just poison. Big Pharma didn't want to work with any academics because a drug comes out of that. It's a generic. It's a generic from day one because you have to license it freely to everybody. So the Bayh-Dole Act came in to say, no, we're actually going to let the universities take sole ownership. Well, the government will let them have it. The government will step out of the way. And they put some mild requirements on it, preferences for U.S. industry and stuff like that, but did allow them to start doing exclusive licenses. And that led to the real boom of academic industry collaboration. MIT's TLO really led the way, did a spectacular job. Harvard, I'm embarrassed to say, here in particular, was a little bit aloof early on and didn't really ramp up its program as quickly. There was sort of this taint that patents were for the technical institute down the river and not for the real purists, researchers at Harvard. But now Harvard's TLO is great, and the Harvard affiliated medical schools are filing loads of patents and are a real big player in the field. Let's see, so what should you do with your, yes?
Sorry, a follow-on question to that statement. So I'm at Harvard Medical School, and
Mhm.
obviously we're funded a lot by NIH and DOD, et cetera. So there is still some language in the funding mechanism which says government does get some rights to
Yes.
patents. Is that something to worry about at all these days? Or
Yeah. So they're called the march-in rights. And what it basically says is that, so theoretically, it's more than theory, it happens. So let's say Schering-Plough develops a series of compounds that might be used to treat a disease. They've got 15 or 20 lead compounds. They pick the one that looks like the best to them. And they're going to take that through clinical trials. They can't afford to take all 15 through. It wouldn't make any sense to take all 15 through. They're going to take one. Hopefully it gets to market. The other 14 will never be investigated because they've got rights to keep everybody else out. And they're not going to develop a drug to compete with their existing drug. So you wind up with IP sometimes locking up things, right? And then if they saw a third party developing something else that might be competition, well, they might want to buy that too and lock it up and keep it from coming in and competing with their drug. So there was a fear that we'd have these government-funded research could suddenly be locked up, and rather than being brought to market to benefit the public, it could be locked up. So they put in something called the march-in rights, where the government would be able, if you were not commercializing the invention, then the government could step in and either force you to license it or just take it and start licensing it to others. It has never, ever, ever been exercised. The closest case came, I'm forgetting the name of the company, but it was a method of isolating T cells for bone marrow transplantation and purifying them and saving them. And the company that had the exclusive rights just wasn't able to do it very well. And there was another company that was actually doing it, and it was working. And then the patent hadn't issued yet. And when the patent issued, they wanted to stop the company that was being successful and was treating people, and so that they could have the exclusive rights when they couldn't get it done. And that came close, and there was a lot of pressure, but they still didn't exercise the march-in rights. But the company that had the rights was under enough pressure that they wound up licensing it. It may have actually been a compulsory license, but I'm not certain.
Some people invent something, patent it, then they start a company and then assign the patent to the company. So
Yes.
why do they do this?
Because you're never going to get anyone to invest in the company otherwise. So when I'm investing in a company, I'm investing in a legal entity, and that legal entity is going to get my money, and that legal entity better have some assets. And so for the founders to say, well, I'm going to keep it. Don't worry, I'll let the company use it, is not going to be adequate. I can't even think of many situations where I've seen the founders license something to the company. So it's usually an assignment. So those are your core assets. That's what will attract the investors. And someone else from my firm could talk about issues with founders and how they get diluted out over time in companies. But that's standard. And anything you invent as an employee of the company, anything that you do within the scope of your employment, is going to be assigned to the company. So now, if you're the night watchman and you invent something, you know, looking at some lab notebooks, that'll be yours. But if you're a scientist at the company working there and that's your job is to do research and invent stuff, the company's going to own it, not you. Let's see. So let's skip that. Yeah.
About assigning the patents by the founder to the company.
Mhm.
Instead of assigning, could the founder license it for like $1 a year? And, you know, so in case of, let's say, bankruptcy,
Mhm.
or any other unforeseen, the patents go back to the founder.
You can try and do that, and I think the VCs won't go along with it. Because if the company goes bankrupt, they want their money back. So they don't want it to go back to you. And, you know, you'd have to do things where if you died, it wouldn't go to your, you know, heirs, it would go to the company. I mean, it would be, you know, it would be a bit of a mess. There's nothing illegal about it, but I have never seen it. I've never seen it in 20 years. It's the rights get assigned to the company. So when you're looking at your portfolio and doing stuff, think about these timelines and how much it's going to cost you. There's this real, you know, tendency, like we've got to file a whole bunch of provisional applications. We've got to get some IP right away. That's really important. We've got to lock up our ideas. And you may not be thinking about what's going to happen, you know, way down the road. So you've got, you know, your application here, maybe spending 15 grand doesn't sound too bad. Okay, we can swing that. That's not too bad. You know, filing the PCT, that's no big deal. You know, okay, the PCT publishes, whoops, just lost all your trade secrets when that happens, so that's kind of key. And then you hit this nationalization date, and you may be up for 250K, and that's like, you know, that could be all of your scientific staff salaries, right? So, you know, do you want to be paying more techs to do work, you know, building prototypes or reducing things to practice in the lab, or do that? So you really got to build that in, think about that, think way ahead, because you set this ball rolling. So try and do selective patenting, figure out what should be patented, what should be a trade secret. There are some considerations there that you can read yourselves. Okay, choke points versus shotguns we've talked about already. Here's an example of this. So in order to produce some class of therapeutic compounds, you've got this huge class, right? So maybe there's 500 compounds that fall within this, and you're not even sure which ones are going to be particularly useful. And if you try and file one patent application covering 500 different compounds, the patent office is going to issue something called a restriction requirement, which is going to require you to restrict your invention to one compound or a smaller class of compound, at least initially. You don't lose the rights to the others, but the patent office isn't going to look at all of that at once in one application, right? And you don't even know which ones to pick yet, right? Because it's early on. But if, you know, there's something that led you to this, that it was some chemical linkage that helped stabilize the structure, or some synthetic step that allowed you to fuse a 5-member and a 7-member ring, you know, in a certain configuration, or to get a certain chirality. And that was the key step that led you to this class of compounds. Then they're irrelevant. And you don't have to worry about that. Go after that choke point. Go after an intermediate. So an intermediate in the synthesis that you had to do. Or let's say it's stem cells. And you know, the court has now made it fairly clear that isolated stem cells won't be patentable subject matter. What about their method of isolation? Did you find, you know, I found a suite of 5 cell surface markers that characterize this type of stem cell and no others. So patent the method of isolation using those, you know, antibodies to those 5 markers. And that's just as good. It gets you where you're going because someone would have to go through that step to get to where you want to be. So look for those choke points. Work with the patent attorneys to draft applications in-house. You all know how to write scientific papers. Patent application is sort of like a scientific paper, not quite, but you can do an iterative back and forth approach with the attorneys to keep your costs down. Same thing with responses. When we're arguing back and forth with the patent office, the examiner says it's obvious in light of reference A and reference B. You know that's nonsense. Write it up and explain it to the attorneys. Send them the arguments as to why that's not true. We'll reword it into legal jargon and send it to the patent office and save you a lot of money as opposed to us trying to figure it out. Okay. So how broad should your patent disclosure be? Let me jump one further. Yeah, I won't. Okay. So you don't want to start dumping into your disclosure all sorts of stuff that you haven't done yet. So if you've accomplished step A, and you want to do it, as part of a larger process, or you've got component A that's going to be part of a larger device, and you start dumping all that other stuff in that you haven't done yet, what are you doing? Well, what you're doing is you're creating prior art. Your own publications can be prior art against you. So you invent step A of the synthesis. Let's stay with the synthesis. Step A of the synthesis, and then there's B and C and D, which you got to get to somehow. You're not quite sure how. And you put all that in your patent application, and the patent office finds that you've only enabled it up through intermediate A. You haven't really taught people how to make the other ones yet. So you're not entitled to the later steps in this patent application because you haven't done it yet. Then, a couple of years later, you figure out how to do the next steps. You file an application on that. Your first application has been published. It's prior art against you. It doesn't matter that you wrote it. Doesn't matter at all. Your own stuff is prior art against you. And it now acts as an obviousness reference against you and prevents you from getting the claims later, okay? So think about whether or not you really need to do that, and are you better off just going with something narrower at the start? In terms of prosecuting claims, same sort of thing. When you're arguing with the patent office for very broad claims may encompass more art. There'll be more question about whether or not they're enabled. Do you want to have that fight now, spending a lot more money, a lot more attorney time arguing for broad claims, when a narrower claim would protect your commercial embodiment? You can go back for the broad claims later. You're not surrendering the right to have them. It's just, what are you going to do first? Choose your battles, start your battles. I'd recommend, most cases, start more narrow. Yeah.
So you were saying something that you could, create your own prior art, and that can prevent you from adding another patent.
Mm-hmm.
But I also heard if you put things into a patent applications, you may not necessarily need to claim it, and you can add claims later on based on that same patent application. So whatever is in there, you could still claim at a later time, right?
Yes. So you can add claims which are adequately supported by the application. So if the application as filed has a written description which would enable one of ordinary skill in the art to make and use the invention without undue experimentation with a reasonable expectation of success, you can add claims to that later. If it's speculative and you're not sure if it's going to work and you haven't fleshed out the details and the patent examiner says well, this is a suggestion that this is what you would do next, but you really haven't taught someone how to do it, I don't think they'd have a reasonable expectation of success. Having all that extra stuff in there does you no good. It creates prior art against you. It's now a motivation for someone else to do it, which is part of finding something obvious, is to find a motivation in the prior art. So your specification can only support claims that meet that standard that I've repeated a bunch of times. And it has to convey to one of skill in the art. Another way it's sometimes phrased is that you were in possession of the invention, that you had it. It's not that you wanted to be able to do it, that you had it, you could do it. One of skill in the art, it would reasonably convey to them that you were in possession at the time of filing of that invention. And that's often not the case. Like people will come up with a protein and they'll wave their hands and they'll say, I claim this protein and conservative substitution variants thereof. No, because you don't know what any one substitution is going to do. And the patent office is not going to let that issue.
But you could do it strategically, but you said that
Yes.
then do that.
Yes. So you can make this decision that I'm going to put in a broad disclosure, I'm going to prosecute the narrow claims. That broad disclosure could now be referred to as a defensive publication. I put that out there defensively. It may prevent me from getting a patent on it in the future because it's prior art to me, but it's prior art to everybody else as well. So I could make the strategic decision to put it out there, basically poison the well. There'll be no patents on the subsequent steps. But if I've got my choke point, that's all I need. And maybe it's more important to me to prevent someone from coming in with a dominating patent on one of my later steps down the road. So there's a lot of strategy that is so case specific I can't summarize it in slides. But timing of filing. So when do you file? So in theory, as soon as the idea is concrete, and concrete in the sense that you would know how to make and use it and all of that, your filing of a patent application is called a constructive reduction to practice, a fictional reduction to practice. It's as if you had made it. But it still has to meet that requirement of conveying to the person of skill in the art that you're in possession and to allow them to make and use it. If you file too soon, you may wind up getting no patent and creating prior art. You could wait until you've actually got your commercial embodiment and it's working and it's exactly what you want to market. That might be too late. It could be that more prior art has come out, which could render your patent obvious, your claims obvious. A competitor may have done something in the intervening period, so you can't sit on your rights too long. So it's going to be a judgment call often. How long do you sit on it? And when do you pull the trigger that you want to file? Knowing that once you pull that trigger, 18 months later, it's published, and it's out there, it's prior art, the trade secrets are gone. And my last point here is that, to the extent inventions come in stages, think about doing the patents in stages as well. And there's no reason to describe the subsequent stages if it's not necessary. Maybe you can just describe the intermediate or the module or whatever it might be, and then follow up later on. International strategy, you just need to think about the markets. It's very product specific, company specific. If you're doing ag bio, you're going to want protection in Argentina. If you're doing pharmaceuticals, you might not. If you're doing software, you're going to want protection in Korea. You're not going to care that much about Portugal. So you got to. This is just something for the business people and the attorneys to work through. What markets do you protect? Where are your competitors? Where are they manufacturing? Think not only about where sales are, but where manufacturing occurs. Politics can be an issue. There are countries where you just, they're unstable, or enforcement may not be realistic, and nobody has a crystal ball that's going to really tell you what to do for a patent that's going to last 20 years. 20 years from now, everything could be different. All right, provisional applications. Okay, so how many have heard about provisional applications and such? All right, so a provisional application is a patent application that can never turn into a patent by itself. You file it with the patent office, they stamp a date on it, they give it a serial number, it goes into a file, and they never do anything else with it. And 1 year later, they can throw it out. Or you can file an application that claims priority to it, that says, I'm now filing a regular application, a PCT application or a US non-provisional application. And I'm claiming back to that priority date. I disclosed my invention back then, so that's my place marker. So I'm entitled to a date a year before my non-provisional or PCT filing because I disclosed it then. A lot of people use them, think that they're cheaper, right? Because they don't get examined. The filing fee is like $150. All right, you fill out a little form, it's fairly easy. I'll have clients will just draft them themselves and send them to me and tell me to file them, and I'll do that. But there are some things you need to know about them. So small filing fees, you got to file within a year. The 20-year term is measured from the non-provisional date. For pharma, this can add a year to your patent term. The most value is in the last years of the patent for a drug, usually, so that's good. You gain a year when it matters. The early years are eaten up in regulatory review. Okay, here's the siren song. So you've got these low filing fees and all these stuff. But the reality is, if the specification does not is not adequate to meet that standard, again, of enabling one of ordinary skill in the art to make and use the invention, if it's not adequate to do that, then the priority date is not valid. So if you file some basically half-assed provisional application with poor disclosure, just dashed off, or you took a manuscript that's going off to nature and you slap a cover on it and say this is a provisional patent application now, it is not going to get you a priority date, because your patent claims aren't going to be in there and they're not going to look the same. They're going to be different words, different description. What's in the paper is probably going to be very narrow. It's going to be exactly what you did in the lab. And if you used, tris hydrochloride, 2 molar, whatever, your claims could get limited to exactly that, right? You're not going to be able to broaden it out. It's going to be what you disclosed. So part of what we do with a patent application is we take we take what you tell us about what you did. We try and find conceptually what's the inventive concept, capture that, broaden it as much as we can, trim away the stuff that's unnecessary, and try to get a patent claim that covers the inventive concept. A quickly written up paper doesn't do that. It usually is the opposite. It is very focused on exactly what happened in the lab. So a lot of people will file provisional applications. They aren't cheap, but they're not effective. I have a question back there. Also, have this tendency to give a false sense of security. Then people go off blabbing to investors and to other people, or they can feel like they can go off to a conference and talk about the invention because they filed a provisional application. But if the provisional doesn't secure you a real priority date, your speech at the conference just became more prior art against you, and maybe another self-inflicted wound here where you're damaging your patent rights. Yes?
Hi. I was under the impression that that the content of a provisional patent was actually not public information for the 1-year waiting period, and I just wanted to confirm that.
Yeah, so if you abandon it, it never becomes public. But the moment you claim priority to it in another application, it becomes a public document. It won't be published, but it's accessible. So if I file a PCT application on the 1-year anniversary, the US Patent Office will, let's say I use the European receiving office, right, for the PCT. They have to send a copy of the provisional over to the European office so that they can check to see what you're claiming now and what you disclosed in the provisional. And they have to match it and say, does this support what you're claiming now? And if your claims are broader than the disclosure here, they're not entitled to that filing date. So they have to examine it, and it becomes part of the public record. It won't be published, but it becomes part of the public record. And if you abandon it, you don't use the provisional as a priority date, it just goes down into the wormhole. So it's no one will ever know what was in it. So that will be kept confidential. Okay. So wise use. Look, if there's an emergency filing, if a paper is about to publish, filing a provisional application, which is a copy of the manuscript, is better than nothing. What it can do is it can remove the exact content of that manuscript from the prior art. All right, so that there's some advantage to that. You can defer prosecution costs for a year. That's a good idea for a startup always. Extend your 20-year term effectively by deferring the start of the count. That's good. Another reason to do it sometimes is just to establish a priority date. If you're going into a collaboration with another company and you're both supposed to bring something to the table, the collaboration will often say, Company A owns everything it owned before the collaboration, and Company B owns everything it owned before the collaboration, but will jointly own what we developed together during the collaboration. Filing a provisional before the collaboration can be a way to, it's like mailing a letter to yourself, a way of establishing this was ours before we started working with you. So this is not collaboration IP, this was our existing IP before the start. It's sometimes done for that. And if there's a race to file, if you hear through the grapevine, from a referee of a paper that the other lab group in your area has submitted a manuscript and you think they're right on top of what you are doing, and you're racing to get to the patent office, a provisional may be the way to do. Okay. and provisionals are often used. There are no VCs here, are there? There are people who just count patents and just say, oh yeah, we have 12 provisional applications on file, and that sounds very impressive to people. When you're doing a presentation, it sounds good. So you may want to file some just you know, to have some cheap PR that you've got a patent portfolio. Okay, rolling provisionals. These are commonly used in the health sciences in particular. People in the tech industry have no idea why you would do this. They build something. When it works, they file an application, right? In life sciences, you're working on things for years trying to get them to work and to develop them. So what you might do is you file a provisional application, and if at the end of 1 year you haven't solved the problem, abandon it. File a new provisional application, adding in there whatever you figured out in the last year. If a year later you've solved the problem, great. You know, file an application claiming priority to that provisional. If not, abandon it, file another one, and you just keep doing these rolling provisionals, okay? And you keep refiling and refiling until you get to the point where you feel that I've got something. And that way you've always got something on file. If a publication suddenly comes out that would be prior art, you can use one of your pending provisionals for a priority date, and at least you're protecting whatever it is you had as of that time, so you don't lose everything. All right, so it's a good way, rather than just, you know, totally deferring filing, file in this fashion. So one after another, et cetera. So again, if a third-party publication appears, then you can file based on that. Essentially what I just said. You could also do it if you really want to maintain your trade secret as long as possible. You can just keep filing provisional applications. No one's figured it out yet, so I'll just keep rolling along my provisional applications. And then if somebody else discovers your trade secret, you say, aha, I've already filed on that, and I've got a date before then. Okay. But you wind up with some self-inflicted wounds here that can happen. You might find out that, you know, you're filing every 12 months, but applications are only published, you know, after 18 months. So Party A is filing every 12 months. They abandon their last one. 6 months after they abandon it, they see Party B's PCT application publishes. And that means that they filed 18 months before. Their priority date was 18 months before, 6 months before you abandoned. And you'll just realize that you lost your gamble there in terms of not filing and relying on it. So it happens. That's the risk you have to look out for. And it really just is impossible to be aware of all the prior art out there. So even if you think you know it, it might be out there. You think you're safe. You abandon your provisional rights and refile. And it turns out that there is the dissertation in Hungarian in the one library in Budapest. Omnibus provisionals are a personal bugaboo of mine. So you had asked about, you know, what happens with a provisional application. Is it maintained in secrecy? And yes, unless or until you claim priority to it. So some people will just do this huge brain dump omnibus provisional application. They'll take every idea that the company has, they put it all down on paper, and they'll just file one application, and here is everything we know and think. And a year later, it might be that of the 20 ideas described in there, you've made enough progress on one for it to be worth filing a patent application on, all right? But when you claim priority to it, the whole thing becomes public. So the other 19 inventions have just been thrown into the public domain. So you can't do that. So this idea of this big giant provisional where you do a brain dump is an awful idea. You should either never claim priority to it and just use it to puff up your portfolio for investors, or the better strategy is you break things up where you wouldn't mind them all going into the public domain at once, and that's how you should look at it. Okay, so there's the self-inflicted wound. PCT application. So the PCT is a placeholder application. It's an international application. It gets a preliminary examination. It gets a preliminary report on patentability from examiners, but a patent doesn't issue from it. That preliminary examination report goes to all the different patent offices. When you nationalize, it has some influence on them. It's not dispositive. If the PCT examiner says it's patentable, it doesn't matter. Each country can come to their own conclusion. You will find things are found obvious in France, but not obvious in England. There's not much you can do. they kick out your expenses to 30 or 31 months, so there's an advantage in that. You get a preliminary examination report, which is actually very valuable because you'll get at least an examiner has looked at it and given you a sense of whether or not it's patentable before you make that decision to spend $250,000. You can look at it and see the best prior art that they could find and the best arguments that they could find, and maybe you'll decide this is not worth the investment because they found a lot of art we are unaware of, or they're unpersuaded about the patentability. Let's cut our losses and run. So the deferred nationalization here pushes back the issuance of the patent. You know, that's very important for the tech industry because, again, you get product obsolescence and things are moving so fast. Generally not an issue in the health sciences, at least not as much. Okay. Don't dump your business plan into your first application. I think we've talked about that. You should only put in what's enabled. We kind of talked about that. And premature filing. Again, don't file something before it's enabled. And we've got an example here, which may be a little hard to follow, but think about this. So I've got in vitro studies, and I show that a compound binds to cell surfaces to a receptor. That receptor is linked to disease, okay? And I immediately say, aha, well, this is a candidate now, for curing this disease. I don't have any data on that, but it's a candidate. You rush out there, you file a PCT that claims claims priority to a provisional a year earlier, and you claim methods of treating the disease. And the patent office says, you've got no data on treating the disease. All you have is that this thing, binds to the receptors. And that's not enough to treat. So they won't give the patents. Okay, so you do more research and you find out, yes, in fact, the binding does inhibit this and it does act as a treatment for the disease. You file a new application, but your first one published and it's prior art against you. And the patent office can, on the one hand, find that your first one is non-enabling, so you can't get a patent, yet it discloses enough to render your subsequent application obvious. You don't get a patent on that either. You get nothing. So you shouldn't be going out there describing or claiming things that you can't back up that aren't enabled. You're just creating prior art against yourself, and you can set up a situation like this. So if you think about sort of what I said about the inventions coming in stages, maybe you can do something else. So if I have studies that show the compound can bind to a cell surface, okay, So first, I claim some in vitro utility. Okay, so maybe it's a marker of those cells. So I'm claiming my compound, not for treatment of disease, but it's a marker for those cells because it will bind to the receptor and it will highlight the cells that are expressing that receptor. That could have some utility. It could be, tumor-specific antigen or whatever it might be. So I claim that first. Right before that's published, now maybe I file my application claiming treatment of the disease. It's not, first one's not prior art to me because I'm filing right before it's published. I bought myself some time. During that 18-month, I've had 18 months more to do research and support my subsequent claims to a method of treatment. So the invention came in stages. I found first I discovered this, fine, patent that. Later, you've got to make the next step, and when you've got that, do your next filing. I'm going to leave some more time for, I'm running out of time for questions, so let's see. Okay. So let's just open it up for any general questions or.
Anybody else? You've asked two already. Just trying to spread the love.
Now, I have just a quick question about trade secrets. When so you're going to the VCs and you go to a number of angels or VCs, and you have not filed a patent and you have trade secrets. Now you can ask them to sign an NDA, which they're reluctant to do, but even if they do, I mean, you're basically kissing a lot of frogs.
Yep.
And each frog knows your trade secret.
Yeah.
What do you do?
So it's a great question. I mean, they won't sign CDAs. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to have to keep track of it. and it puts you at risk, and you're absolutely right. I mean, you think about a VC that looks at 100 companies a year, and yours is one of them, but they don't fund you. And then the next year, they look at another 100 companies, they pick one to fund that's doing something similar to what you did, and they think they have a great idea, and they suggest, why don't you try this? They don't even remember that they got it from you, and they wind up passing on your trade secret, and you're exposed. And the answer is, they've got the money, you need the money, you bear the risk. I mean, that's basically it. There's no answer. I mean, you can plead for them to file a CDA, to sign a CDA with you, a confidential disclosure agreement, but most of them will refuse. And if you don't like that, then you can go find another angel or another VC, but they'll probably do the same thing. It's just it's a disparity of bargaining power issue, and there's nothing much to do about it.
Yeah, I have a question about your omnibus provisional. Let's say you had 20 of your ideas dumped in this provisional, and you actually then filed a non-provisional for one of them. Do the other 19, first of all, does that provisional now get published, or including all, and does that get published 12 months or 18 months after? And so therefore, if it does become public, you still have 6 months to polish off the other 19 claims, if you will.
It's not ever published, but becomes publicly available.
12 months or 18 months?
At the time of filing, the day you file. The day you file something claiming priority to it, you have made it a public document. Now, no one in reality will be able to get it right away because they won't know that you filed, and so there's a reality component to it. So that when your PCT publishes at 18 months, that's when people will probably first become aware of your priority claim. At that point, they can then go to WIPO and request a copy of the provisional. It'll even take a while for, it may ultimately get loaded into a database so that it can be downloaded. And that may take longer than 18 months. But the legal fiction is maintained that the date of filing was the date that you agreed to make it public, so as of that date, it's public. It's like things that are available through the Freedom of Information Act. It can take 7 years to get them, but they're always publicly available. So it's not when someone gets it, it's when they could theoretically have gotten it.